My favorite title for any piece of media is a toss-up between two. The first is the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I love this title because of how well the name plays into both the themes and the style of this movie. Breaking the meaning down, the title describes the way the characters, a pair of ex-lovers who choose to have their memories of each other wiped, hence the spotless mind, are doomed to re-experience their relationship with each other over and over and over again, because they have none of the memories associated with each other, good or bad, hence the eternal sunshine. On top of the metaphorical yet literal meaning of the title, I also love the way that this title presents itself. It's wordy, confusing, yet creative sounding and pseudo-scientific, which fits perfectly with the way the film is presented, with its avant-garde, art pop-esque aesthetic. It's an excellent title, one that takes the medium it represents and elevates it further. The other is the exact opposite. Rather than simply describing the work, this title assigns a new meaning to the work altogether through its title alone. The conceptual art installation, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, created by English artist Damien Hirst. I love this title because, rather than explaining the work like Eternal Sunshine and most other pieces do, it creates an entirely new framework to view the piece through. The piece itself is a shark kept in a box of formaldehyde. The title is seemingly a non sequitur that, maybe if you stretch it enough, might be able to, in some metaphorical sense, describe the work in some way. To me, though, I find the fact that one has to develop their own meaning out of the two elements a much more interesting manner of interacting with the piece than just having the title that spoon-feeds the meaning to the viewer. Naming art is only a recent phenomenon. The concept began around the 1700s, around the time when we saw a rise in literacy rates and when secular art became more commonplace, with the creation of art installations and public museums. Artwork before this was seldom titled. Some of the most well-known works in history were never named. There was no need to name them. They were made for an audience who were largely illiterate. There was simply no need for a title. If someone wanted to talk about a painting, they would refer to it by colloquial names. Often, artwork was commissioned by an individual and would be hung in that person or their family's home, never displayed for public viewing. Since the commissioners knew exactly what they were getting, the artists never had a reason or a chance to name their works. In the same way we don't give names to the photos we hang on our walls or the artwork given to us by our children. Titles are often given little afterthought. After all, it's the art that drives all the emotions we feel in our judgment and perception of each piece. But yet, even without seeing any of these pieces, you know exactly how they look. Sure, some of that can be chalked up to simply how famous these particular paintings are, but when we look at other, equally famous pieces, it becomes significantly more difficult to visualize them. Their titles, in a sense, allow us to see these works in a completely different way. I want to use this time as a way to introduce an art installation I think about almost daily. This work is simply two light bulbs strung together. As with any other piece of conceptual or modern art, it's easy to look at this and think, that's stupid, or I could make that myself. But in my opinion, where this piece speaks the loudest is not in its physical embodiment, but in its title. Untitled, March 5th. Felix Gonzalez Torres held this naming convention for almost all of his works. Untitled, then a descriptor to indicate which untitled this one was. Some, if not most, even lack this clarifying descriptor. We'll come back to this idea of entitling something Untitled, but first I want to talk more about March 5th. The light bulbs here are intertwined together, and over the course of time they begin to fade, slowly, bit by bit, until one day, one of them extinguishes entirely. Eventually, the other bulb goes out too. March 5th, 1991, is the day that Felix Gonzalez Torres' partner, Ross Laycock, passed away due to AIDS complications. While without the title, one could read the piece as simply an interesting look into entropy and how one day everything fades away. The title, March 5th, assigns a date to that light fading out. As mentioned before, Untitled March 5th is not the only work that follows this untitled pattern. Another work, perhaps the most well-known and discussed of Gonzalez Torres, is named Untitled Portrait of Ross in L.A. Made up of 175 pounds of wrapped candies, visitors and viewers are expected to take a piece home with them. As with March 5th, these elements are very much so intentional. The 175 pounds represents the body of Ross, his partner, and by allowing visitors to take the candies home with them, Portrait of Ross in L.A. demonstrates the weight and the body slowly withering away over time. On January 9th, 1996, Felix Gonzalez Torres passed away due to complication from AIDS. Most of his works were left untitled intentionally so. With each of these works, we are forced to draw our own conclusions. There is no longer someone to whom we can ask, what is the meaning of this? Without titles, we haven't even a clue as to how to perceive each work from the artist's perspective. However, this seems to be exactly what was intended. Gonzalez Torres notoriously loved keeping his art open to interpretation. In his eyes, the thing that made his art what it was this ability for each person to perceive it in their own particular way. The untitled naming convention was the perfect way to support this. Each set of parentheses may help lead you in the direction, but none of them are going to tell you exactly what you're supposed to think. In the same way he created these abstract, hyper-conceptual works of art, he named each work in this abstract, conceptual manner. The titles of Felix Gonzalez Torres take their works and elevate them by entirely reframing each work in a new light. These works are interesting, but would be meaningless to the viewer without these titles to frame them. Selected Ambient Works, Volume 2 by Aphex Twin follows a similar approach as the untitled works of Felix Gonzalez Torres. Not a single piece on the album is titled, but rather each composition is entitled by one of 24 photos. Since it's impossible to discuss music without having words to identify it, two courses of action were taken. The first, by the record label, was to title each piece by its respective track number. Becomes number 1, becomes number 2, and so on and so forth. While it's understandable to title tracks this way because it's the simplest and most straightforward way to do so, in the digital age, the walls are broken down when it comes to what a track can and cannot be named. The esoteric titles of the four-tet aliases and have titles that could never be spoken aloud by a human being, and that was done with every bit of intention. The song would be significantly less intriguing and impactful if it was simply called Four-tet Track Number 8. In the same way that the persistence of memory would be so much less impactful had it have been named Melting Clocks on Abstract Background. The second method chosen to label these Aphex Twin tracks was the one developed by the fans, to name each track based on its respective photo. These new names breathed new life into the tracks, giving them a whole new perspective to look at them through. My favorite of these are the ones that, without a better way of explaining it, attempt to recreate the feeling of the photo, rather than exactly what the image is of. These fan interpretations of the titles feel, although imperfect, much closer to the artist's intention in naming the tracks this way. Francisco Goya, in his time, was known mostly for his portrait commissions and wartime paintings like the 3rd of May, 1808. However, after he left his countryside villa to his grandson, it was discovered that he had painted 15 murals on the inside of his home. These paintings, called the Black Paintings, became the work that defines Goya's legacy today. Most famous of this collection of dark and deeply unsettling paintings is the infamous Saturn devouring his son. This collection of paintings was never spoken of by Goya, and the works were almost certainly never meant to be viewed by the public. Most pertinent to this discussion, however, is the fact that Goya himself never named these paintings. Each was titled upon their transfer from Quinta del Sordo to the Museo del Prado. Saturn devouring his son, as such, is very likely a misnomer. We aren't certain that the figure here is even Saturn, or that the painting has any relation to the myth whatsoever. In the original story, Saturn swallows each of his children whole, but here, the victim is violently torn limb from limb. We aren't even certain that the dismembered figure here is even intended to be the son, or male for that matter. It begs the question, does creating a new title for a work strip the piece of its original intent? This is far from the only time that the title assigned to a work changes the perceived intent of the piece. Pasiphae by Jackson Pollock is named after the myth of the queen who gave birth to the Minotaur. However, Pollock intended for the work to be named Moby Dick, until a curator told him he should entitle it Pasiphae, after the mythical queen. "Who the hell is Pasiphae?" Pollock responded. So then, what is the point of a title? Obviously, the title names and defines the work and what that work is of. But I think it goes much deeper than that. The title is the final element, that last step that breathes life into the work. We've discussed many different titles that break the norm of describing simply what a work is of. But even in the titles that may not be as nuanced, as creative, or as abstract as some of these irregular ones, they still are important. They elevate the works in ways that couldn't be possible if the work were to speak for itself. With the more abstract paintings of the Impressionist or Cubic movements, those simple titles, describing what the object of the photo is, can truly speak volumes. Yes, these artists could have chosen unique and abstract titles, but yet, they chose not to. Instead, we are given simply what the painting is to represent, and we are to make our own assumptions based on it. I do not think there exists such a thing as a bad title. I certainly think that there are good, and even great titles, but I don't really think you can find a bad title. You could certainly make an argument for titles such as The Room or Troll 2 being terrible, but I think the fact that these terrible works were given equally terrible titles is exactly what keeps them from being bad titles. You can have boring titles, you can have ill-fitting, needlessly long, or misleading titles, but I think that each title is a representation of its work, and that as such, it is impossible to find a bad title. Even to take the easiest route, to leave the work untitled, often ends up speaking to and for the work itself. Titles provide us with a way to discuss our favorite works in a way that would never be possible in their absence. We can talk about our favorite books, movies, albums, songs, etc., thanks to their often overlooked yet ever-present existence. We go so far as to assign works our own new titles in the event of their omission. The title is the unsung hero of our media, and the thing that allows us to connect with our media and with each other the most. Next time you think of your favorite piece of entertainment or a work that resonates with you, think about its name. Think about how its title has allowed you to talk about it with your friends. Think about what the words, however abstract or however average they may be, mean in the context of your favorite work. And the next time you go to give a name to your project, think of the way that that title will breathe new life into this thing that you have created.